So what am I doing this Friday? Sometimes my videos are comment response and they have a UAD video playing, or they're a big comment response because someone's made a very interesting question and the entire video is around that question. And sometimes they're continuations of other videos. Basically, Friday is my random video day sometimes. And this week, that's going to be the case. Next week, it's going to be a continuation of the series, which is going to run all week. But this week, it is a continuation to an extent of the Juna Cole video from a few days ago. Why am I continuing this video? Because someone pointed out to me that, well, isn't the Juna Cole really just another offset strategy? And it is. In fact, a number of other people commented that, frankly, the modern offset strategies are just variations of the Juna Cole. And they're right. But the offset strategy comes from a slightly different perspective. Because the offset strategy is far more about systems than platforms. As a rule. There are some exceptions to that rule, but as a rule, it's far more about systems than platforms. And honestly, most of the offset strategy can be explained by the need to make people feel safe in a world that's getting increasingly scary, while no one's really quite sure how to actually be safe. Or rather, we know how to be safe, but no one wants to spend that amount of money, because if you spend that amount of money the whole time, you will cripple your economy. There is a reality to that. There are times when I talk to people and they go, well, we spent this much money during World War II. Yes, that's during a world war. Goes back to the points I make at various times about you have so much money, you have so many people, you only have so much resource you can deploy about something, and the amount of resource you can deploy to war during a period of total war is different than you can in peacetime. In peacetime, you need to be running a civilian economy. Even in total war, you have limitations on what you can run, which always scares people when I say this, but it is the case. There are limitations. You can't just go out there and go, but I want to do it that way. Well, that's nice, but you can't. It isn't going to work out that way. Sorry, sugar. It just ain't. With that in mind, the offset strategy. It's about economics. It's about finding a way to defend yourself against the threat of total war without spending like you're already in a total war. Now, it gets pretty interesting when we start looking at the original offset strategy. It gets even more interesting when we start looking at current obsessions with offset strategies, because there are limitations to all these things. So, the first offset strategy comes from Eisenhower officially. Unofficially, we could talk about the Juna Cole and various other things. Flotilla defense, torpedoes as a whole, all these things can be said to be an offset strategy. It basically comes from a baseline idea which can be encapsulated in some of the sayings which come from the American Civil War: it's better to expend things than people. People are far more difficult to replace than things, and people are far more useful than things in the long run. That's life. It takes a long time to train skilled personnel. When we talk about a ship, people often go, well, how long does it take to train a sailor? Well, for starters, you're not just training the sailor, you're training the people who will then train that sailor. But more importantly, you're training all the people at the various levels of command in that ship. So for your senior NCOs and senior officers, you could well be talking best part of 2 to 3 decades. That's a long time. And that's not including the time it took to train people to train them. This is why militaries are so much in terms of people tend to focus on them going, well, they're an ongoing tradition. They're all about this and that. Well, the tradition tends to be part of trying to preserve the institutional memory when it works well. When trust me, tradition, like anything, is open to being. I would hesitate to use the word corrupted, but hijacked. Tradition is as open to being hijacked as anything else. But when it works, it's incredibly useful for keeping the institutional memory alive. When it works. So, we've had a long standing love affair with the concept of not expending your own people. First offset strategy: nuclear weapons. We have such devastating, overwhelming firepower. Do not make war on us. Our strength is no more measured in divisions. You can send your pouring armies of massed personnel across our borders, fine, but they will have no cities to return to. They will have no population to return to. And by golly, if they're at any point concentrated enough, they will not be able to return to. That's what you're threatening. That's your first offset strategy. Mass murder. It lives for many, many years. It's basically the cornerstone of mutually assured destruction, with both sides going, you do it, we'll do it to you. It's not nice. And in many ways, it's worthy of being called something different rather than a continuation of the Junacol. It is worthy of being called an offset strategy, setting it apart. But offset strategy is a rather nice clinical name. It's very Eisenhower and the way he runs a war. There is something which has been inherited from him throughout NATO and the military forces that have come since World War II, a desire to make war seem more palatable. It's an offset strategy, not a total destruction strategy. There are some problems with its application. It is presumptive in the first part on the bomber getting through, and then on the missile getting through. And also, it's presumptive on the person at the top being sufficiently callous they are not going to bother about committing death on a scale which, and this will probably get some interesting results, would make Pol Pot, let alone Mao and Stalin, be envious. Won't even start on our Hitler. And the trouble is, whilst democracies do tend to be led by people who are attention-seeking self-publicists, that's the nice way. People who are people-pleasers. They like the roar and appreciation of the crowds. It's rare that someone is, how would I put this? Emotionally controlled and callous enough to happily, and not even happily, to be able to sign off on that much destruction. So it's a bluff. The first offset strategy, I would argue, is a bluff. Because unless your opponent actually does employ these things, you're not going to. So when we carry on to Vietnam, and really I would say the first offset strategy shows it's a bluff in Korea and various other scenarios where nuclear weapons are not used. You're being completely and utterly trumped. You're being whooped. And you don't turn to nuclear weapons. Why? Because, well, let's be honest, in Korea, we're not talking about retaliation. That's not the threat. No, in Korea, it's just people don't want to. It's so much destructive firepower. And Vietnam, again, the Americans win the battles and lose the war. It's one of the interesting things that post Vietnam, they come up with the second offset strategy. And I would argue the vast majority of the strategy is about keeping American troops out of the fighting because they won the battles and lost the war. The North Vietnamese army, the Viet Cong, they could do some daring, really, really amazing guerrilla actions and could score some startling victories. But ultimately, things like the Tet Offensive, the American and the South Vietnamese forces were winning and won. The trouble is, South Vietnam was not really set up that well by either the French or the Americans. And, well, ultimately, it's not just about winning battles, it's about winning a war, it's about will and a question of hearts and minds. And those were lost with some very, very stupid and nasty actions. So post Vietnam, they come out and they seek a second offset strategy. A new way to win a war. It hoped through precision strike, through stealth, through being able to go where others couldn't, to maximize American power, to maximize American technological capability. And in many ways, it is building on the American technological frameworks which have been developed during and after the after World War II. America had a very advanced technological base, and they were able to build upon that. They were able to do a lot of research and development. They were able to go for these options, and it's very attractive. Spending money to save money, investing to save, and you're investing in things which look very sexy and very high tech and are secret. So they're going to make everyone feel like being part of a special club when they know about them. This is probably the most famous of the second offset strategy. Yes, the B2 is part of it as well, but let's be honest. The F-117 is the centerpiece. It's the first stealth jet. It's the first thing which is really used for that. And unsurprisingly, when they announced that they're going for a third offset strategy, roughly in 2014, one of the things they push for is the B-21, which is an evolution of the B-2. It's a long-range strike aircraft. It's a heavy bomber. It's again about being able to hit targets from a long, long way away. And you can argue the third offset strategy is a reaction to what has happened since the second offset strategy, but also since the end of the Cold War. In that, generally, because nations like America and the UK and other Western nations have been fighting, well, the last time Britain really fought a near peer was Falklands War, 1982. America Hasn't even fought a near peer in a long time, let alone a peer-on-peer conflict. This has meant that they have developed strategies which look great on paper, but haven't really been tested. They're tested on computer simulation, they're tested in exercises, they're tested where rules are neat and people follow laws. And every time you have a new conflict around the world, people look at it and go, oh, what can we learn? And it's amazing how many of the old lessons are retaught again and are quickly put aside in favor of a new sexy which can come out. It's one of the interesting things. When drones were really doing well in Ukraine, they were all talk. That was a new rage of warfare. But when things changed in terms of air defenses and the style of conflict going on to be a less permissive environment, and suddenly drones were proving less useful, well, everyone started getting very quiet and ignoring it. The fact is, drones are part of modern warfare. Drones are going to be used as part of modern warfare. But they're also part of modern warfare where you can guarantee people are not going to start knocking down satellites or just disabling satellites. And there are lots of nations working on those capabilities. That's a peer or near peer threat. Why has Russia not gone after the satellites which are supporting the Ukrainian military? Mostly because they are using commercial satellites, which are owned by other powers, and it would widen the war. And it could cause all sorts of issues the moment you start going into that. There are a lot of options available, but the third offset strategy starts in 2014. And in many ways, it is an attempt to square a circle. It's an attempt to deliver and use new, eye-wateringly expensive technology to once again offset enemy capabilities. There is a small problem with it. It's not really an offset strategy. Why do I say it's not an offset strategy? Because the first strategy was using nuclear weapons to offset the mass of the Soviet Union, which was still believed to be overwhelming despite the losses and the limitations of their own infrastructure and logistics suffered in World War II. Very quickly afterwards. The second offset strategy is used to, again, offset the conventional capabilities. Basically, the idea is, well, hang on, we aren't going to go nuclear. All right, if we're not going to go nuclear, we need to find a way to get around their conventional capabilities. So how are we going to offset their mass with conventional skills? We're going to have to use technology for it. So it's sort of a technology route, again, around mass. The third offset strategy, that's using technology in many ways to offset technology. And this is where it starts to get more into an actual arms race, or at least a tech race, than to really a strategy, because it's complicated in how these things are going to interact and where they're going to be applicable. A large, sluggish aircraft like the Global Hawk is probably not that helpful if you are patrolling confined waters like the Baltic or the Black Sea, or the Arabian Gulf, or any of these areas. But it's absolutely essential if you're trying to maintain overwatch over the Pacific and the Atlantic, or the Indian Ocean, any of these huge expanse areas, where honestly you need the ability to fly high and stay up there for a very, very long time. In many ways, what we're seeing in drones and technology is a realization that one size will not fit all, that you cannot build a universal system. What's interesting is the medium powers seem to be realizing this quicker than the larger powers. I'm not sure why. Britain has launched this, which is a really quite cool idea, and some people are linking it to saying it's a fourth off-threat strategy. I'm never quite sure if the third one was ever actually delivered on. It was talked about a lot, but now we're talking about a fourth one. They're coming around very quickly. The first two had roughly almost 30 years between them. There was roughly again 30 years between the second and the third. Now the fourth is here after 6 years? Really? Either the world has changed dramatically quickly, or we're now using offset strategy as code for we don't know what we're frigating doing, so we're going to fudge it up a bit and see what comes out. And that's not probably incorrect. You have a legitimate scenario where now governments prefer to risk and invest in things than people, because people are more expensive, especially if they get killed, because then they're expensive in terms of political capital, which is what democratic governments often seem to care about more. They don't like to lose people. They don't like to think about losing people. So the fourth offset strategy. What do they really boil down to? Well, there's a lot of use of uncrewed systems. Yay! That'll be interesting. But there is also a realization that in a peer conflict, those uncrewed systems might suffer from communications degradation. So it's how autonomous do you make them? Do you make them fully autonomous, applying a kill order? Well, that could be problematic because that would be what you would degrade immediately. Do you make the kill order automatic? Do you make them completely autonomous? Do you manufacture the equivalent of a Star Wars droid army? They won't look like the droid army, they probably won't be bipedal. Because let's be honest, that's a really inefficient shape for a robot. It's going to be a problem. What does it mean in terms of ships? Because, let's be honest, it's problematic enough on land where you can probably track these things down. At sea, they could honestly disappear. We have whole cruise ships which are completely abandoned and are basically drifting with the world and just full of rats running around the world. We're not sure where they are. What happens if Terminator's ship goes off for a jaunt and we're not sure where that is? And again, people are going to say, well, we have satellites. I refer you to the cruise ship, which is literally drifting, and we are not quite sure where it is. Every time we think it's sunk, someone spots it. By the time anyone gets out there to collect it, it's no longer there. It's been going around for about a decade. So, yeah. And let's be honest, the Terminator ship will probably be a lot better at hiding its location and more designed to hide its location than a cruise liner is. So, it's going to be interesting. It'll be very interesting seeing what this particular ship, XV Peter Patrick Blackett, will actually get up to. It's part of Navy X, which has its own Twitter. By the way, you can follow Navy X, what the Royal Navy is currently doing, on Twitter. And its autonomous development is, it's billed as the Autonomy and Lethality Accelerator Program. This ship is named after a noted former Royal Navy officer who went on to become a very noted physicist and scientist and was key in World War II to a lot of the technologies we developed and used World War II. So, really is a very interesting ship and a very interesting name and a very interesting Twitter account to follow. That's Navy X. What will be most interesting will be what this vessel is loaded out with at any one point. And by the way, that's why I think she's going to be called the XV Patrick rather than HMS. She's an experimental vessel, and that's what she's going to be covering. But either way, the third offset strategy hasn't really delivered anything, and they've moved on to a fourth. Probably because both were very badly defined. It seems to be both these strategies have been, we've got all this new technology coming in. How do we use it? What do we use it for? What does it do? What does it do indeed? What do you want it to do? I think this is the basic problem I think we have these days with strategy, is that quite easy you could omit what you wanted to do with it. We want to be more lethal. We want to be able to take the enemy's life, or at least stop them taking our lives and win the battle. Now, we can't say it like that. Or at least if we do, we sound rather nasty when we say it. And it's not nasty. It's pragmatic. There is also the scenario that you have to think about, what are you prepared to fund? Those who listen to bilge pumps will regularly hear me and Drac and Jamie say there is a difference between what people want to do and what they're prepared to fund. There is a difference between what politicians and leaders of countries usually state their aims are and what they want, and what they're prepared to fund the capability to actually be able to do. And the problems arise when they expect the forces to carry out the things they want to do without being prepared, without funding it. Who knows? Hopefully this will not be part of that. Although I have to say, I'm quite interested in this hull design, etc. for Navy X. I think this is a fairly good hull, a fairly interesting hull design. And I could see it adapted to uncrewed vessels. It's an interesting vessel. As it's not a warship, the RN were able to get it built by Damen, which is good. And they produce, the Dutch, a very interesting ship, as has been said again on bilge pumps and various other things many times. The Dutch build very good ships, and this is a very good little ship. Its capabilities included the ability to carry at least 2 TEU containers, attain a speed of 20 knots, be less than 48 meters long, and It's technically a vessel based on its FCS 4008 design. Specifications include the vessel has a top speed of 25 knots and a range of 1,200 nautical miles, with 140 meters squared of cargo deck. It's going to be interesting to see how it performs and what it does. It's going to be interesting to see how it swaps in with the Navy. One of the things you've also got to remember now, though, for Britain, and to an extent for America and other nations, is quite a lot of their future navies, which are going to be their navies for 20, 30 years, are already under construction. The Royal Navy has both the Type 26 and Type 31 program under construction. Making major changes to those designs will require a massive recosting. Yes, the Type 32 hasn't been boiled down onto yet, but they're probably going to be an evolution of the Type 31 design. Type 83, the next generation destroyer, we don't know. In the US, the ones who are talking most about a fourth offset strategy, it certainly looks like from their current design images they're producing of their future destroyer to replace the Burke, they've admitted they've gone from the Zumwalt class powertrain, and they've gone for the Burke class, the current new generation of Burkes coming in, sensors and equipment, and they've decided to redevelop an entire new hull, which would seem to be strange. You have you're taking the power system from one vessel. It's already got a new hull. Why aren't you using the existing hull? Well, it doesn't look right. It's not conventional. There are reasons. There are always reasons. And I can understand those reasons to an extent, but there's part of me which thinks it's a bit of a waste of money when you already have a hull designed. So what do I expect from a fourth offset strategy? And I'll be interested to see what you all think of the fourth offset strategy. If you want to go read some articles, please do a Google search, because you might find something which I haven't found. But from what I'm reading on the fourth offset strategy and what I'm seeing actually coming about, at the moment, I don't see the third and fourth offset strategies being more than just phrases used for funding gimmicks. The first offset strategy had a real reason, had a real capability, and was designed around something. Nuclear weapons and the horrific capabilities those have, but it was designed around something. The second offset strategy, that was designed around technology to counter conventional capability. The third, are we in a third or fourth still? I don't think they ever really defined the third, so I don't think we can really be in a fourth. I think they haven't yet come up with what the third or the next offset strategy is really going to be. My suspicion is it's going to involve long-range strikes and fires, which would explain the B-21, certainly would make it viable, and HIMARS and all the various other systems which are being put in place and are proving themselves very useful. But I think also resilience is going to be part of it. Resilience is something which is crept in really with the discussions of the fourth more than the third. And resilience seems to me to boil down to, are we building ships that they can be ships in terms of naval services? Are we building ships that can continue operations if they are damaged? Now, what is the level of damage you're going for? There are certain things that if they get damaged, you're gone. But also there's other scenarios you can do, like, for example, close-in weapon systems. If you design a ship with only two, and you position one on each side of the ship, then if one goes, you've no longer got close-in weapons protection on one side of the ship. That's no resilience. If you position them fore and aft, one goes, you lose 45 to probably 50 degrees of coverage. But you still have some resilience. If you have three positioned in some form of triangle, let's say 2 forward, 1 aft, well, you lose very, depending on which one goes, you lose very little coverage. Because the aft has a 270-degree coverage, maybe more. The others will have their own degrees of coverage. It basically, each one will be able to fill in to a large extent for the other two. So if one goes, the other two can cover most of that one's loss. I would argue, looking at it and looking at the resilience, though, that we are more seeing a return to the practices of construction which continued into the 1950s and sort of tailored off and sort of to extent in the 1960s, but have been quite common before and during World War II and even prior to that. That you're building a ship which is for war. And the reality is, a warship is not going to be operating in a perfect environment, and it's going to have to take some damage. Why do we talk about multiples for turrets? Why do we dual turrets? It doubles your firepower. It also increases the complexity. But as I said before, one gun, one times the problems. Two guns, twice as complex. Twice as many problems as one. Three, 4 times as many problems. 4, 8 times as many problems, sort of going up. But the thing is, if you have one gun in a turret and it goes down, that turret no longer is useful. If you have 2 guns in a turret and a gun goes down, you still have 1 gun. Turret 50% effective. It's still effective. It will still fire something, which is better than nothing. It'll be interesting to see how resilience affects ship design. It'll be interesting to see whether there are big impacts in powertrain and power supply. We've had this ongoing for a while, though. Trying to develop new power systems affected the Arleigh Burkes, affected the Type 45s, affected the Zumwalts. Type 45s famously have their issues. Now, this is because they're designed with 2 power packs. As was said, they could have been designed with a set of 3 power packs. They would have been slightly bigger. They would have generated far more power than they probably needed, but they would have had the advantage that if one power pack went down, they'd have had the other two to cover it. Now we're having to insert larger diesel engines, diesel generators, for the want of a better description, to cover for if a power pack goes down. That's, you can argue, a fault of design. The resilience wasn't built in. Everything was based on things being perfect. And working as it worked on a computer. We will see. We will see what will happen. But this is now the offset strategy video, and I hope you found it interesting. As said, if we go back to the beginning, the first offset strategy is about nuclear power. It's about using awesome, overwhelming firepower to commit, let's be honest, mass murder in order to offset the mass of an opponent. And it's cheaper to have all of these than it is to have equivalent divisions or overmatch the divisions. Post Vietnam, it's a realization that you're not going to use those nuclear weapons in that sort of scenario. So you'd better have a different way of dealing with mass, and preferably a way which doesn't involve you sacrificing a lot of lives and having to pay the political cost in blood that Vietnam induced, which is why you get all the stealth systems and the precision weapons. Tomahawk cruise missiles. Third offset strategy. Someone talked about the air-sea-land battle at one point in this. It's a fun thing to consider. But honestly, the trouble for the third offset strategy and the fourth is that we're living in an era where technology is in transit. But we're not quite sure where it's going to end. That is one of the interesting things. When we consider it, this comes in not at the dawn of the nuclear age, but in the 1950s, when it was a decade in and we had an understanding of the technology we were dealing with. We're not a perfect understanding, but we had an understanding. We knew what we were dealing with. To be honest, quite a lot of this stuff owes its roots back in the World War II era and have been slowly being developed and tinkered with and evolved since that point. So again, it's stable to enough that you can actually build and project on it. The problem with this and this is we really don't know. To me, I'm looking at the development of uncrewed aircraft and I see it potentially changing the air group of carriers again and turning them into very, very powerful and potent long range strike assets. But that's mainly because we've currently lost the range capability that carriers used to have. And that was their big advantage. They could take you out at very long range. There is a debate. If carriers end up going away, what replaces them? Well, is it going to be large ships like a Kirov class? It could be, festooned with a huge number of missiles. If you think about it, that is basically the definition of an arsenal ship. It's replacing the magazine and ability to resupply of a carrier to launch its strike aircraft with individual missiles as a payload. Well, that's going to be a huge ship. That's going to be an arsenal ship. But is that a flexible enough asset? Because the other advantage of a carrier is the persistence assistance it can give you in other ways. Or are we looking at a fusion of those things? Are we going to be brave enough to push for a fusion? Are we going to have the money to push for a fusion? Because if you're going to fill up an arsenal ship, that's going to cost a lot in missiles. You think paying for an aircraft carrier is expensive. Wait until you're filling up something the size of an aircraft carrier with missiles. We don't know. And we're not going to know really that soon. So, fourth offset strategy, we haven't yet got the third. We've talked a lot of buzzwords, we've talked a lot of phraseology, but we don't really know what it's going to be. Anyone who's certain about it tends to be people who are paid and are certain because of reasons of their employment. And I'm not saying that as for salesmen. No, it's when I hear generals and admirals being certain about what the third offset strategy is, or the fourth offset strategy is, They're certain because they're having to tell governments, and you have paid to be certain. So you're certain. But the technology is changing so fast, and next year you'll probably be certain it's something different because you'll have to be because it's changed. And you have to be honest about that. But you're always going to sound certain. I'm not certain. I think it's interesting. I think it's worth a discussion. I don't think. I think the first and second do have something to do with the Junicol. I think the third and fourth are probably more to do with the Junicol though than the first and second because the more and more you look at them, the more and more it seems to be about saving money and shrinking armed forces to do more with less, which is a much loved phraseology. Anyway, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and yeah, forgot coming up. Ooh, lots of things. Lots and lots of things. It's going to be the Portland class on the 2nd of August, not the New Orleans. Anyway, thank you for watching. Take care. Now, where is that fuzzwuzz which keeps buzzing around me? How am I going to track you down?